My name is Trifina Dawn. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've worked in corporate contract strategy, one of those roles people rarely notice until something goes wrong. If you met me in a meeting room, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I'm not the loud one. I'm not the one who interrupts people mid-sentence to sound clever. I'm usually the person sitting quietly at the end of the table, taking notes, asking one or two precise questions near the end when everyone else has already decided the conversation is finished. Some people interpret that as hesitation. Others interpret it as a lack of confidence. Over the years, I've learned something about those assumptions. People often reveal more about themselves than about you when they decide who you are too quickly. At the company where this story took place, I was known for being reliable. The kind of employee who could take a chaotic negotiation, a complicated contract, or a client that nobody else wanted to handle, and somehow turn it into a signed agreement a few weeks later. Not dramatic work, not visible work, but valuable work. At least that's what I thought, because this story isn't really about one meeting, or one comment, or even one missing bonus. It's about how small decisions inside a company slowly reveal what people actually value and what they quietly believe they can take away without consequence. The moment everything started was surprisingly ordinary. Our department had just closed the largest contract we'd signed in nearly 3 years. It had taken months of negotiations, late-night revisions, and careful diplomacy with a client that had already walked away from two other vendors before us. When the agreement finally came through, the company celebrated. Emails went around, executives congratulated the team. There was even a short mention during the quarterly meeting. And somewhere inside that process was a detail that mattered a lot to me. A $25,000 performance bonus written directly into my compensation agreement, specifically tied to closing a deal of that size. I didn't ask for it. I didn't negotiate it afterward. It had been promised from the beginning. So when HR called me into a short meeting a few weeks later and calmly explained that the bonus had been withheld, I assumed there had been some kind of mistake. But the explanation they gave me wasn't about performance. It wasn't about revenue. It wasn't even about the contract itself. They told me the decision had been influenced by my attitude in meetings. More specifically, apparently I didn't smile enough. At the time, I thought the situation was confusing. Later, I realized something much more important. Because a few days after that conversation, accounting accidentally forwarded me an internal email thread that I was never supposed to see. And once I read it, the entire situation stopped being confusing. It became very, very clear. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or public humiliation. It's about what happens when someone quietly realizes the rules of a system and decides to follow them more carefully than the people who created them. Before we begin, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment at work where the official explanation didn't quite match what your instincts were telling you? If you had asked my coworkers to describe me back then, most of them would have used the same three words: reliable, calm, quiet. None of those words was meant as insults. In fact, in most offices, they're considered compliments. Reliable people keep projects moving. Calm people don't create drama. Quiet people make meetings shorter. But there's a strange side effect to being described that way for long enough. Eventually, people start to believe you exist mainly to absorb pressure, not to receive recognition. At the firm where I worked in Seattle, our department handled enterprise contracts for technology clients, large agreements that could stretch across hundreds of pages and millions of dollars. My job sat right in the middle of that complexity. Sales teams would bring in potential deals, legal would outline risks, finance would worry about margins, and somewhere between those departments, someone had to translate competing priorities into a contract that both sides would actually sign. That someone was usually me. I didn't mind the work. In fact, I liked it. Negotiations fascinated me. Not the aggressive kind where people try to dominate the room, but the quiet kind where you listen long enough to understand what everyone is really afraid of losing. Most of the time, if you solve that fear, the deal solved itself. Still, this kind of work rarely comes with applause. When a contract succeeds, executives celebrate the revenue. Sales celebrate the client relationship. Leadership celebrates the strategy. The person who quietly aligned the details behind the scenes rarely becomes part of the story. I had accepted that years earlier. In fact, I had built my entire professional identity around the idea that visibility wasn't necessary if the outcome was correct. And for a long time, that belief worked. Managers trusted me with difficult negotiations. Coworkers asked me to review complicated clauses. When a client relationship started slipping, my name often appeared in the email thread. Can Trifina take a look at this? What I didn't notice, at least not immediately, was how that quiet reliability shaped the way people viewed my role inside the company. To them, I wasn't the person who won deals, I was the person who fixed them, which meant something subtle happened whenever success was discussed. The spotlight moved somewhere else. My direct manager, Daniel Harper, was the one presenting results to senior leadership. He wasn't a bad manager in the obvious sense. He didn't yell, he didn't micromanage. If anything, he was the kind of leader companies often reward, confident in meetings, comfortable presenting numbers, and very skilled at translating team achievements into executive language. I attended those meetings sometimes, usually sitting quietly along the sidewall, laptop open, in case someone needed clarification about a clause or timeline. Daniel would walk leadership through the contract outcomes, revenue projections, client commitments, strategic implications. And every now and then, he'd gesture vaguely toward me and say something like, Trifina helped finalize the documentation. That was the phrase. Not negotiated, not structured, not secured the agreement, just finalized. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. Titles and phrasing were political things. The real satisfaction came from seeing the contract signed, and in most cases, the company compensated performance fairly. My employment agreement included a specific clause tied to high-value deals. If I successfully closed contracts above a certain revenue threshold, a performance bonus would trigger automatically. It wasn't enormous by executive standards, but $25,000 is still meaningful when it's tied directly to the work you did. The deal that triggered that clause took nearly 6 months to complete. It involved a stubborn client procurement team, 3 different legal revisions, and several late-night calls across time zones. But eventually, one quiet Tuesday morning, the signed agreement arrived. The department celebrated, emails went out, executives congratulated the team, and somewhere in the background of that celebration, my name appeared exactly the way it always had. Thanks to everyone who supported the process. Reliable, calm, quiet. At the time, I thought that was simply how things worked. What I didn't realize was that the real story had already started unfolding in rooms I wasn't in. Rooms where people were discussing something that technically belonged to me, the bonus, and the decision about whether I would actually receive it. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come with drama. No confrontation, no tense meeting, just a short calendar invite from Human Resources. The subject line was simple: compensation review, follow-up. At the time, I assumed it was routine. Large deals often triggered small administrative steps afterward, verifying contract details, confirming revenue milestones, things like that. So when the meeting appeared on my calendar for Thursday afternoon, I accepted it without much thought. The HR office sat on the quieter side of our building, away from the open-floor workstations where most of our department worked. Soft lighting, neutral furniture, framed motivational prints that tried a little too hard to look reassuring. The kind of room designed to make uncomfortable conversations feel procedural. When I walked in, Laura Chen from HR was already seated at the table. Laura had always been polite with me, professional, careful with her words, the kind of person who rarely rushes through explanations. That day, though, she looked slightly more formal than usual. Not nervous, just measured. After a few minutes of polite conversation, she opened a folder in front of her. Trifina, she said gently, I wanted to discuss the bonus clause tied to the Northbridge contract. I nodded. That makes sense, I replied. I assumed the revenue confirmation process had finished. Technically, the bonus was triggered once the client signed and the first payment cleared. Finance had confirmed that earlier that week. So, from a contractual perspective, everything should have been straightforward. Laura paused before continuing. Well, the leadership team conducted a broader evaluation of performance factors related to the deal. That sentence was the first moment my instincts stirred slightly. Not an alarm, just curiosity. Performance factors? I asked. Yes, she said, maintaining the same calm tone. In addition to the contractual outcome, management sometimes considers collaborative dynamics and leadership presence in cross-department meetings. I remember sitting there for a second, letting the sentence settle, because it sounded abstract. Contracts don't usually operate on abstract concepts, they operate on outcomes. Still, I waited. Laura glanced briefly at the document in front of her before speaking again. There were some concerns raised about your engagement style during several leadership discussions throughout the negotiation process. I tilted my head slightly. My engagement style? She nodded. The feedback we received suggested that your presence in meetings sometimes appeared reserved. Leadership felt that a more visibly enthusiastic attitude might have strengthened internal alignment. For a moment, I thought she might elaborate. She didn't, so I asked the obvious question. Are you saying the bonus wasn't approved? Laura folded her hands carefully on the table. The leadership team decided not to issue the performance bonus in this case. The room stayed very quiet after that. Not because I was angry, but because the explanation didn't match the structure of the agreement I had signed when I joined the company. The clause was very clear: close a contract above the specified value, and the bonus activates. There was no language about enthusiasm levels, no clause about facial expressions. Still, I kept my voice calm. Just so I understand, I said slowly, the deal met the revenue threshold, correct? Yes. And the client signed the final agreement? Yes. And the project originated through our department? Yes, I nodded. Then what exactly disqualified the bonus? Laura hesitated just long enough that the answer felt rehearsed. The leadership feedback specifically mentioned that you didn't appear particularly positive during several executive briefings. I looked at her. She held the same professional expression. Then she added the phrase that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. They felt you didn't smile enough during key meetings. There it was, not poor negotiation, not missed deadlines, not contract errors, just a perception. Something subjective enough that it couldn't be measured, but apparently strong enough to override a written compensation agreement. I remember leaning back slightly in my chair, not arguing, not protesting, just absorbing the moment. Because this was the first small cut, not dramatic enough to become a formal conflict, but sharp enough that I couldn't pretend I hadn't noticed it. Understood, I said quietly. Laura looked relieved that I wasn't pushing back. We truly value your contributions, she added. This was simply a leadership perception issue. I thanked her for the explanation, stood up, and walked back to my desk. No one in the office noticed anything unusual. The deal was still being celebrated. Emails were still circulating. The department was already chasing the next opportunity. And from the outside, nothing had changed. But something subtle had shifted inside my mind. Because when a company decides that subjective impressions outweigh written agreements, it quietly teaches you something important. Not about fairness, about how decisions are actually made. And once you start seeing that pattern, you begin paying attention to details you might have ignored before. For the first few days after that HR meeting, I told myself the situation was probably temporary. Companies make inconsistent decisions sometimes. Leadership teams disagree. Policies get interpreted differently depending on who's involved. It happens. And if I was honest with myself, there was also a practical reason I didn't push back immediately. I had spent years building a reputation inside that company as someone who stayed calm under pressure, someone who solved problems instead of creating them. The moment you challenge a decision too aggressively in a corporate environment, you risk shifting that reputation overnight. So I did what I had always done. I kept working. The next Monday morning, our department held its usual weekly operations meeting. The same conference room, the same group of managers and team leads gathered around the table, with laptops open and coffee cups scattered between them. Daniel Harper stood at the front of the room, guiding everyone through the pipeline updates. When the conversation reached the Northbridge contract, the one that had triggered the bonus clause, the tone of the room shifted slightly. Big deals always do that. They become stories. Daniel clicked on the slide showing the revenue projection. This one was a tough negotiation, he said, smiling confidently toward the leadership team dialing in through video. But we managed to get it across the line. There were a few approving nods around the room. Someone asked a question about implementation timelines. Another manager congratulated the team. I sat quietly near the end of the table, exactly where I usually sat, listening, observing. Daniel continued explaining the contract structure, highlighting the pricing model and the strategic value for the company. He spoke well. He always had. Then, just like in previous meetings, he gestured briefly in my direction. Trifina helped finalize the documentation. That same phrase again. Finalize. As if the months of negotiation had simply been a clerical task at the end of the process. No one challenged the wording. No one corrected the impression. And the strange thing was, I didn't challenge it either, at least not out loud, because by that point, I had already started noticing something. The HR explanation about my attitude in meetings hadn't appeared out of nowhere. It had been building slowly. Small moments I hadn't taken seriously before were beginning to line up in my memory. For example, there had been a meeting about halfway through the Northbridge negotiation where Daniel had stopped the discussion to make a casual comment. Trifina, he said lightly, you should smile more when presenting. It makes clients feel more confident. At the time, the room laughed a little. I smiled politely, adjusted the slide, and kept going. Another time, during a cross-department briefing, one of the senior directors joked that I had the calmest poker face in the building. Again, everyone laughed. None of those moments felt hostile when they happened, just office humor. But after the HR conversation, they started looking different, like small signals that had been quietly shaping a narrative about me. Not aggressive, not insubordinate, just insufficiently cheerful, which would have been a strange thing to measure under any circumstances, but especially strange considering the nature of my job. Contract negotiations don't usually benefit from excessive smiling. They benefit from patience, from listening, from saying less than the other side expects you to say. Still, inside the company culture, enthusiasm often mattered more than precision. And once that cultural expectation becomes normalized, something subtle happens. People stop questioning it, even when it begins influencing decisions that were originally supposed to be objective. That Monday meeting ended the way they always did. Everyone closing laptops, gathering notes, drifting back toward their desks. No one mentioned the bonus. No one asked why the person who negotiated the deal hadn't been rewarded for it. From the outside, everything looked completely normal, which is exactly how patterns like this survive inside organizations. They don't arrive as an obvious injustice. They arrive as quiet reinterpretations of reality. And if you don't challenge them early, they slowly become accepted truth. For a while, I told myself I could live with that. After all, one withheld bonus wasn't the end of a career. But what I didn't realize yet was that the decision wasn't just about money. It was about defining my role inside the company going forward. And the longer I stayed silent, the more comfortable everyone else became with that definition. Reliable, calm, quiet, useful, but apparently not quite deserving of what had been promised. There's a moment in many workplaces that most people don't notice when it happens. It's the moment when your role stops being defined by your job description and starts being defined by other people's expectations. For me, that shift happened gradually. So gradually that at first, I thought I was imagining it. A few weeks after the Northbridge contract closed, another negotiation started forming in our pipeline. Smaller than the previous deal, but still important enough that several departments needed to coordinate closely. As usual, Daniel asked me to lead the contract structure. Trifina is great at smoothing these things out, he said casually during a planning call. The comment sounded complimentary, and technically, it was. But the phrasing caught my attention. Smoothing things out, not designing a strategy, not driving negotiations, just smoothing, like someone who arrives after the real work is done. I didn't correct him. Instead, I did what I always did. I opened my notebook, outlined the negotiation priorities, and began coordinating with the legal and finance teams. The process moved forward efficiently. The client was cooperative. Within a few weeks, we had a preliminary framework ready for executive review. That review meeting took place in one of the larger conference rooms, glass walls, a long polished table, and a large screen at the front. Senior leadership joined remotely. Daniel led the presentation. About halfway through, he paused and looked toward me. Trifina can walk us through the contract mechanics. I nodded and connected my laptop to the screen. Slides appeared, risk structure, payment schedule, service level guarantees. I explained each section clearly, the same way I had done dozens of times before. Calm, precise, without unnecessary theatrics. When I finished, there was a short pause. Then one of the senior directors chuckled lightly through the video call. "See, that's what I like about Trifina," he said. "Always steady. No drama. The room smiled politely. Someone added, "She's like our quiet safety net." The phrase hung in the air for a moment. Quiet safety net. Again, it sounded positive, but underneath the compliment was something else. A subtle boundary. Safety nets catch people when they fall. They don't usually receive credit for the performance happening above them. The meeting moved on quickly after that. Budgets were approved, timelines were set, and the negotiation entered its next phase. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. But that evening, as I reviewed my notes at home, I realized something important. Inside the company narrative, my identity had become very clear. I wasn't the strategist. I wasn't the closer. I was the reliable stabilizer who made everyone else's work function smoothly. And once an organization places you in that category, expectations change. You're trusted with responsibility, but not always with recognition. You're expected to fix problems, but not necessarily to benefit when those problems are solved. Most employees respond to that realization in one of two ways. Some become louder. They push harder for visibility, correct people publicly, and demand credit more aggressively. Others simply accept the role. They decide stability is enough. For years, I had quietly belonged to the second group. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed competence would eventually speak for itself. The withheld bonus, though, had introduced a new variable. It showed me that competence alone didn't control the narrative. Perception did, and perception was being shaped in rooms where I wasn't always present. At first, that realization was uncomfortable. Not because it felt unfair, but because it meant something about my strategy inside the company had been incomplete. I had spent years mastering negotiations with clients, but I had never seriously studied the negotiation happening inside the organization itself. Who shaped decisions, how reputations were constructed, which conversations actually influenced outcomes. And once I started thinking about those dynamics, something subtle changed in the way I approached my workdays. I began observing more carefully. Not just contracts, not just negotiations, but people. The way credit moved through a conversation. The way certain voices carried more weight than others. The way narratives are formed slowly through repetition. Reliable, calm, quiet. The role had been assigned. The only question left was whether I would continue playing it exactly the way everyone expected, or whether I would start understanding the system well enough to adjust. The moment things shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no sudden revelation in the middle of a meeting, no sharp argument that changed the atmosphere in the room. It happened on a Tuesday evening, long after most of the office had already gone home. Our floor had that quiet, hollow sound buildings get after business hours. The low hum of the ventilation system, the occasional elevator chime down the hall, the faint glow of desk lamps scattered across mostly empty workstations. I stayed late that night because I wanted to finish reviewing a set of contract revisions before the next morning's meeting. It wasn't unusual for me. Negotiations often moved across time zones, and sometimes quiet evenings were the only moments when you could think clearly without constant interruptions. Around 7:30, my inbox pinged. At first, I barely noticed it. Just another email in a long thread of project updates. But when I glanced at the subject line, something felt slightly out of place. It was from accounting, specifically from someone named Marcus, a senior financial analyst who occasionally handled internal compensation documentation. The subject line read, Bonus authorization, Northbridge contract. For a moment, I assumed it was a delayed confirmation. Maybe the earlier decision had been reviewed again. Maybe finance had finalized something HR hadn't mentioned yet. I opened the message and immediately realized something strange. The email wasn't written to me. It had been forwarded accidentally as part of a longer internal thread. My name only appeared in the subject line. The conversation itself included Daniel Harper, someone from finance, and two executives from upper management. At first, I hesitated. Technically, the email wasn't meant for me, but the thread had already been delivered to my inbox. And once a message is sitting there on your screen, curiosity becomes difficult to ignore. So I started reading. The first few messages discuss standard compensation approvals, numbers, revenue confirmations, and internal budgeting. Then the thread shifted. One of the executives asked a simple question. Should we release the performance bonus tied to the Northbridge contract? Marcus from accounting responded with a short note confirming that the contractual criteria had been met. Then Daniel replied. His message was only a few sentences long, but it changed the entire story I had been told. He wrote, I'd recommend holding off on the bonus for now. Trifina contributed operationally, but we should be careful about setting the precedent that her role qualifies for this level of incentive. Sales leadership expects more visibility and executive presence for bonuses of that scale. I read the sentence twice, not smiling enough. That had been the explanation HR gave me. But Daniel's message said something completely different. This wasn't about enthusiasm, it was about precedent, about redefining whether my role should qualify for the compensation structure that had been written into my agreement. The thread continued. Another executive responded, If the contract clause applies, are we exposed legally? Marcus from accounting answered that the clause appeared straightforward, but suggested consulting HR before making a final decision. Then Daniel wrote one more message. This one is shorter. HR can frame it as a cultural feedback issue. That was the moment the room felt quieter than it already was. Not because the message was aggressive. It wasn't. It was calm, professional, almost casual. But inside that short sentence was a very clear strategy. The explanation given to me about my attitude in meetings wasn't a spontaneous leadership concern. It had been constructed. A narrative designed to justify a decision that had already been made. I leaned back slowly in my chair. For several minutes, I didn't move. I simply stared at the screen. Not angry, not shocked, just clear. Because once you see the real reason behind a decision like that, a lot of other moments start making sense. The comments about smiling, the casual jokes about my poker face, the subtle reframing of my role in meetings, they hadn't been random observations. They had been preparing the ground for a different interpretation of my work, one that conveniently made the bonus clause optional. After a while, I closed the email. The office was almost completely dark by then. I packed my notebook into my bag, turned off the desk lamp, and walked toward the elevators. Something had changed that evening. Not in the company. The company was still operating exactly the way it had before. But inside my own thinking, a quiet adjustment had taken place. Until that moment, my silence had mostly been a habit. After that night, it became something else, a choice. The morning after I read that email, nothing in the office looked different. People were still walking in with coffee cups and laptop bags. The usual low buzz of conversations floated across the open floor. Someone was laughing near the sales desks about a client call that had gone badly, normal office life. When Daniel walked past my desk, he nodded casually. Morning, Trifina. His tone was exactly the same as always. Calm, friendly, professional. There was no sign that he knew I had seen the email thread, and I didn't give him any reason to suspect it. Morning, I replied, opening my notebook. That was the moment my silence officially changed from instinct to strategy. Before that evening, I had stayed quiet because I believed professionalism meant not reacting emotionally to every unfair decision. Now I stayed quiet because information is more valuable when the other side believes you don't have it. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to the way conversations moved through the department. Daniel continued presenting project updates in leadership meetings. He continued using the same phrases when referring to my work. Trifina helped finalize the documentation. Trifina supported the negotiation process. Nothing technically inaccurate, but always positioned just slightly behind the people being credited for closing the deals. I noticed something else too. When new projects started, Daniel often introduced them to leadership before looping me into the discussion. By the time I joined the conversation, the narrative about who was driving the work had already been established. It wasn't malicious in an obvious way. It was simply efficient for him. Credit flowed upward. Support flowed sideways, and the quiet person in the room rarely interrupted that pattern. If I had confronted him immediately after reading the email, the entire situation would have turned into a dispute over interpretation. He could have claimed the message was taken out of context. HR could have repeated the attitude in meetings explanation. The company could have framed the disagreement as a misunderstanding. But the one thing that would have disappeared instantly was clarity. So I waited. Waiting isn't passive when you're paying attention. It's an observation. And the more I observed, the more patterns started revealing themselves. For example, I realized that Daniel wasn't the only person shaping narratives about work inside the company. There were quiet influence networks that existed between departments. Finance teams discussing budget priorities. HR is discussing compensation frameworks. Sales leadership is discussing which employees they consider strategic contributors. Those conversations rarely happened in formal meetings. They happened in short email threads, quick hallway conversations, private Slack messages between managers. And occasionally, if you were patient enough, they surfaced accidentally in places they weren't supposed to, like the email that had landed in my inbox. Over the next couple of weeks, I made a small change in the way I handled my work. Nothing dramatic, just more documentation. Every negotiation summary I wrote became slightly more detailed. Every project update included clearer records of who made which decisions. Every major conversation was followed by a short email recap. Not accusatory, just precise. At the same time, I started studying something I had ignored before, my own employment agreement. Most employees sign those documents once and never read them again. But contract language is my profession. And when you look carefully at agreements like that, you start noticing things. Clauses about performance incentives, clauses about role definitions, clauses about dispute resolution. None of it felt urgent yet. But the more I reviewed those details, the more I understood something important. The company had relied on my silence because they assumed I would continue interpreting the situation emotionally. Frustration, disappointment, maybe quiet resignation. But contracts don't operate on emotions. They operate on evidence. And for the first time since the bonus decision, I began thinking about the situation the same way I would analyze a difficult negotiation. Not personally, structurally. If a company decided to reinterpret an agreement after the work was completed, what options existed inside the system? What leverage mattered? What timing would make a response irreversible? Those questions didn't make me angry. They made me focused. Because once silence becomes a choice, it stops feeling like weakness. It becomes space to prepare, space to understand the board before making a move. And the most interesting part of that preparation was something Daniel never seemed to notice. The quiet person in the room was paying closer attention than anyone else. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There are no speeches, no visible strategy meetings, no sudden shifts in behavior that make people curious. Most of the time, preparation looks exactly like the routine everyone expects from you, which in my case meant continuing to be the same person they thought they understood. Reliable, calm, quiet. The only difference was that my attention had become sharper. Before the bonus situation, I paid attention mainly to contracts and negotiations with clients. After reading that email thread, I started paying equal attention to the internal structure of the company itself, how decisions were documented, where authority actually sat, which departments created the official record of events. It turns out that large organizations run on two parallel systems. There's the visible one, meetings, presentations, announcements, performance reviews, and then there's the quieter one, documents, approvals, archived emails, compensation frameworks. The second system matters more than most people realize, because when disputes happen, the visible conversations fade quickly, the documentation stays. Over the next few weeks, I built a habit of organizing information the same way I would prepare for a complex client negotiation, not collecting secrets, just preserving facts. Every time I led a negotiation call, I saved the call summaries. Every time Daniel referenced the Northbridge deal in a meeting, I recorded the phrasing in my notebook. Every email thread discussing contract structure, revenue thresholds, or bonus policies went into a carefully labeled folder. Again, none of this looked unusual. Contract strategists document things. It's part of the job. What no one noticed was that I had also begun mapping something slightly different. The timeline. When the Northbridge contract closed. When the revenue confirmation was issued. When the bonus clause should have activated. And most importantly, when the internal email discussion about withholding the bonus had taken place. Those dates mattered because they showed the decision wasn't a reaction to my attitude in meetings. It had been discussed after the contract conditions were already fulfilled, which meant the explanation HR gave me was more of a narrative than a cause. At the same time, I started learning more about how compensation decisions move through the company. Finance handled the technical confirmation of bonus triggers. HR handled communication with employees, but the final approval often came from department leadership, which meant Daniel's recommendation in that email thread hadn't been casual, it had been influential. Still, I didn't rush toward confrontation. Confrontation is rarely effective when the other side believes they still control the narrative. Instead, I did something simpler. I kept performing my job at the same high level I always had. More contracts moved through the department. More negotiations closed successfully. More leadership meetings happened where Daniel presented results and occasionally referenced my work in the background. From his perspective, nothing had changed. In fact, the situation probably looked stable. The employee who had lost a bonus wasn't complaining, wasn't escalating, wasn't even asking questions anymore. Silence, in most corporate environments, is interpreted as acceptance. And that assumption worked in my favor. Because while everyone believed the situation had quietly settled, I was studying something they had overlooked: the company's own rules, employment agreements, compensation policy guidelines, dispute resolution procedures, and one particular section that almost no employee ever reads carefully. The clause describes how compensation disputes must be reviewed if evidence suggests contractual obligations were not honored. That clause didn't guarantee a specific outcome, but it guaranteed something else: a formal process. A process that required documentation from multiple departments: finance, HR, leadership. And once that process started, the internal explanations people had used informally would need to appear in written form, which changes the tone of conversations very quickly. Because casual narratives that sound harmless in private emails often feel different when they become part of an official review. Still, I wasn't ready to start that process yet. Not until I understood every piece of the situation. Not until I knew exactly what leverage existed. And most importantly, not until I confirmed something I had been wondering about since the night that email arrived: whether the thread I had seen was the only conversation about the decision, or just the first one that had surfaced by accident. By the time a month had passed after the Northbridge contract closed, the office had already moved on. New deals were in progress. Quarterly targets were approaching. Leadership meetings were focused on future revenue instead of past negotiations. Inside the company's rhythm, the bonus decision had quietly disappeared. No one mentioned it anymore, which was exactly why the next piece of information arrived so unexpectedly. It happened on a Friday afternoon, around 4 o'clock, when most people were already shifting mentally toward the weekend. I was finishing a contract review when a message appeared in my inbox from Marcus, the same financial analyst whose name had appeared in the email thread I had accidentally received weeks earlier. The subject line was simple: quick question about Northbridge reporting. That wasn't unusual. Finance occasionally asked for clarification about how certain contract structures were categorized for revenue reporting. I opened the email. Marcus asked a short technical question about the way one of the payment milestones had been structured in the agreement. I answered it quickly and sent the response back. A few minutes later, another message appeared. Thanks. Appreciate the clarification. Then, a few seconds after that, a third email arrived. This one was shorter and noticeably less formal. Also, just so you know, that whole bonus situation looks strange from the accounting side. I stared at the screen for a moment. Not because the comment was shocking, but it confirmed something important. Other departments had noticed the irregularity too. I typed a careful reply. Strange how? Marcus responded almost immediately. Well, usually once the contract clause is confirmed, the bonus authorization is automatic. Finance just verifies the numbers. That matched what I already knew. But, I wrote back, there was a pause before the next message appeared. Your case was the only one I've seen where leadership intervened after the confirmation. I leaned back slightly in my chair. So it wasn't just unusual, it was unique. Another message arrived. Honestly, I thought HR had already explained everything to you. Technically, they had, just not the real explanation. I kept my response neutral. They mentioned leadership concerns about meeting dynamics. Marcus sent a short reply that looked almost amused. Yeah, that's not what the discussion looked like from our side. For a moment, I considered asking him directly about the email thread I had received earlier, but there was no reason to risk putting him in an uncomfortable position. Instead, I asked a simpler question. Was there more discussion about the decision after that? This time, the pause lasted longer. When his reply arrived, it was only one sentence. Let's just say it came up more than once, then another, and finance documented everything because the clause was written pretty clearly. That sentence mattered a lot because it meant the internal conversation about the bonus wasn't limited to the email I had seen. It existed inside official financial records as well. Documentation, confirmation dates, authorization discussions. From an accounting perspective, the situation hadn't been interpreted as a cultural feedback issue. It had been interpreted as a compensation exception, which meant something very simple. The company had created a narrative for me, but the internal documentation likely told a different story. I typed one final message. "Thanks for letting me know. I appreciate the transparency." Marcus responded with a brief reply. "No problem. Just thought you should have the full picture." Then the conversation ended. No drama, no dramatic revelation, just a quiet confirmation that the situation I had been studying was larger than one manager's opinion. When I closed my laptop later that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt since the HR meeting weeks earlier. Not frustration, clarity. Because leverage doesn't come from anger. It comes from understanding where the truth is recorded. And now I knew something important. The company's own systems had preserved the exact sequence of events. The contract, the confirmation, the decision to override it, the explanations that followed, all of it existed somewhere inside their internal documentation, which meant the next step wasn't about discovering new information. It was about deciding what to do with the information that already existed. And that decision would change everything. For several days after my conversation with Marcus, I didn't take any action. From the outside, my routine looked unchanged. I arrived at the office at the same time every morning. I attended the same meetings. I worked on the same negotiations. But internally, I was weighing something far more important than a bonus. I was deciding how much of the system I wanted to engage with, because there were multiple paths available to me. The first option was the simplest. I could do nothing, accept the company's explanation, continue working, and treat the missing bonus as an unfortunate but isolated event. A lot of professionals make that choice, not because they're weak, because stability has value. Jobs provide income, structure, and a predictable future. Challenging leadership can disrupt all of that very quickly, but that option came with a long-term cost. If I accepted the decision quietly, the narrative about my role would become permanent. The company would have effectively rewritten the meaning of the bonus clause, at least in my case. And if another large contract is closed in the future, the same reasoning could appear again. Not smiling enough, not enthusiastic enough, not visible enough, different phrasing, same result. The second option was confrontation. I could walk into Daniel's office, show him the email thread, and demand an explanation. That might feel satisfying for a moment, but confrontation rarely produces clarity in corporate environments. People become defensive, narratives become complicated, and the discussion turns into a debate about tone instead of facts. The third option was escalation. I could immediately file a formal complaint with HR, arguing that the company had violated the compensation clause in my employment agreement. That route had potential, but it also carried risks. HR departments exist to manage risk for the company, not necessarily to resolve disputes in favor of employees. If I escalated too early, the process might close quickly with the same explanation I had already received. And once a complaint is officially resolved, reopening it becomes much harder. So there was a fourth option, one that required patience. Instead of arguing emotionally about fairness, I could trigger the formal review process defined in the contract itself, not a complaint, a contractual inquiry. The difference might sound small, but in legal terms, it matters a lot. A complaint asks the company to reconsider its behavior. A contractual inquiry asks the company to prove its interpretation of the agreement. And proof requires documentation, finance records, approval timelines, internal reasoning, all of which would need to be assembled and reviewed by multiple departments. If the company's explanation truly was that my attitude in meetings invalidated a bonus clause, they would need to explain exactly where that authority existed inside the contract language, not casually, not verbally, but in writing. I sat with that thought for a long time one evening at home, my notebook open on the table. The decision wasn't just about money, it was about something quieter. Integrity, not moral superiority. Just alignment between what an agreement says and how it's applied. Companies often assume employees won't challenge those details, mostly because employees don't study contracts the way negotiators do. But I had spent years building a career around understanding exactly how agreements function under pressure, and once I saw the situation through that lens, the answer became clearer. I didn't need to accuse anyone. I didn't need to argue. All I needed to do was ask the company to walk through its own process. If their explanation held up under documentation, then the matter would end there. But if the documentation told a different story, then the narrative about my attitude in meetings might start looking very fragile. That night, I wrote a short draft email. I didn't send it yet. I just read it carefully. Calm wording, no accusations, no emotion. Just a request to initiate a contractual review of the compensation clause tied to the Northbridge Agreement. The moment I finished writing it, I understood something important. Sending that email would change the situation permanently, because once a formal process begins, it creates a record. And records have consequences. I closed my laptop without sending it, not because I had changed my mind, but timing matters in negotiations, and the next step I was about to take needed to happen quietly. The following Monday morning looked exactly like every other Monday. The office lights were bright, coffee machines were working overtime, people were exchanging quick updates about the week ahead. Nothing in the building suggested that a small shift was about to begin. That was intentional. When you initiate a formal process inside a large organization, the first step rarely happens in public. It happens quietly, in documentation systems and administrative channels that most employees never think about. At 8:12 a.m., before the first department meeting of the day, I opened my laptop and reread the email draft I had written the previous evening. It was addressed to HR, with finance copied. The subject line was simple: Contractual Compensation Review, Northbridge Agreement. The body of the email was calm and direct. I referenced the specific clause in my employment agreement that tied a performance bonus to the successful closing of contracts exceeding a certain value threshold. Then I listed 3 confirmed facts. The Northbridge contract had met the revenue requirement. The client had signed the final agreement. Finance had verified the payment milestone. Finally, I wrote one short request. I asked the company to initiate the formal contractual review procedure described in Section 9 of the employment agreement in order to clarify why the bonus clause had not been executed. No accusations, no mention of the email thread I had seen, just a request to follow the company's own process. Before sending it, I paused for a moment, because emails like that don't create noise immediately. They create paper trails. And once a paper trail begins, departments that normally operate independently suddenly need to coordinate their explanations. I clicked send. Then I closed the message window and walked into the weekly operations meeting. Daniel was already standing near the screen at the front of the room, organizing his slides. The meeting proceeded exactly the same way it always did. Pipeline updates, revenue projections, a few jokes about difficult clients. At one point, Daniel mentioned the Northbridge contract again, referencing it as a great team effort. I sat quietly taking notes. If he had received the email notification yet, he gave no indication. Corporate systems can take hours, or sometimes days, before messages like that reach the right internal channels. After the meeting ended, the day continued normally. I reviewed contracts, responded to client emails, scheduled negotiation calls, but somewhere inside the company's internal systems, the process had already started. The HR department would log the request. Finance would confirm whether the compensation trigger had technically activated. Leadership would likely be asked to provide clarification about the decision. Individually, none of those steps felt dramatic, but together, they created something organizations take very seriously: documented questions about contractual compliance. Later that afternoon, I received the first reply. It came from Laura in HR. Her message was polite, professional, and slightly more formal than our previous conversations. She confirmed that my request had been received and that the contractual review procedure had been initiated. She also mentioned that several departments would need to review the matter before providing a final response. Estimated timeline, 2 to 3 weeks. I thanked her and returned to work. From the outside, nothing had changed. No tense meetings, no rumors are spreading through the office. Just another administrative process moving quietly through internal channels. Which meant that for now, most people, including Daniel, likely believed the situation had already settled weeks earlier. And that assumption was about to create the most interesting part of the entire situation, because when a system starts asking questions after everyone thinks the story is finished, people often struggle to explain the decisions they made the first time casually. Not because they intended to do anything wrong, but because narratives that sound simple in conversation become more complicated when multiple departments begin comparing notes. Finance has numbers, HR has policies, leadership has explanations. And when those three things don't align perfectly, someone eventually notices. For the moment, though, my role was exactly the same as before: reliable, calm, quiet, working on the next negotiation while the company slowly began reviewing the last one. The shift didn't happen overnight, but once it started, it didn't stop. At first, it was subtle. Conversations in the office changed tone when I entered the room. People who once spoke over me now paused, just slightly, waiting to hear what I would say. Not because I demanded it, because something about my presence had changed. One afternoon during a strategy meeting, the same manager who used to challenge every suggestion I made presented a new proposal. Halfway through explaining it, he stopped. Then he looked at me. "Do you think this will work?" The room went quiet. 6 months earlier, that question would never have been directed at me. I didn't rush to answer. I leaned back slightly, studied the numbers on the screen, and spoke calmly. "It will work if the execution team can handle the timeline." A few people nodded. Someone wrote down what I said. The manager adjusted his plan. That was the moment I realized something important. Respect had arrived quietly, not because I fought for it, not because I proved to everyone wrong, but because I had stopped trying to be seen and started focusing on becoming someone worth noticing. Outside the office, the effects appeared too. Old acquaintances suddenly reached out. Some were curious, some were friendly, some simply sensed that something about me had changed and wanted to reconnect. But the dynamic was different now. I didn't chase conversations, I didn't explain myself. I listened more, spoke less, and when I did speak, people paid attention. One evening, while walking home through the quiet streets, I thought about the past year, the doubts, the frustration, the invisible battles no one ever saw. It had all been necessary, because the strongest transformations rarely happen in public. They happen in silence. And the consequences of silence were only beginning. Power rarely announces itself. It doesn't walk into a room and introduce itself the way people imagine. Most of the time, power reveals itself through small changes in behavior, tiny adjustments that are almost invisible unless you're paying attention. And I was paying attention. It started with meetings. For years, those meetings had followed the same predictable pattern. Certain people spoke first. Certain people dominated the discussion. Certain opinions carried more weight than others. Mine usually came near the end, if at all, but something subtle had changed. One Monday morning, during a quarterly planning session, our director was reviewing the proposed strategy for a new client expansion. Slides moved across the screen. Numbers, forecasts, projections. Halfway through the presentation, the director paused. Then he looked directly at me. "Trifina, Vitsechas, you worked closely on the last contract in this sector." The room turned. "What do you think?" Moments like that tell you more about an organization than any formal announcement. Nobody had promoted me. No new title had been announced. But suddenly, my opinion mattered. I glanced at the projections. The assumptions were optimistic. A little too optimistic. So I spoke the way I always did, calmly, without drama. "If we move forward with this timeline," I said, "the negotiation leverage will shift to the client after phase 2. Silence. A few people leaned forward. The director frowned slightly. "Explain." So I did. Not emotionally, not defensively, just the logic, the leverage points, the contractual triggers, the places where the company could lose control if it rushed the timeline. When I finished, no one interrupted. No one joked. No one dismissed it. The director slowly nodded. "Adjust the plan," he told the team, and the slide deck changed. That was the moment I noticed something else. The people who used to challenge everything I said weren't speaking. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had started listening first. Power had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Later that afternoon, while walking past the glass conference rooms, I overheard two colleagues talking. One of them lowered his voice slightly. "Have you noticed something about Trifina lately?" The other replied quietly, "Yeah, A pause. Then he said something that made me stop for a second. She doesn't try to prove anything anymore. Another pause. That's why people believe her. They weren't wrong. The biggest shift hadn't happened around me. It had happened inside me. I no longer needed validation. I no longer needed approval. And when you remove those needs from your behavior, something interesting happens. People start treating you differently. But the most interesting consequence of that change was still coming. Because not everyone in the company was comfortable with the new balance of influence. Some people prefer things the way they used to be, predictable, controlled, safe. And when those people start realizing the ground beneath them is shifting, they don't always react calmly. That reaction would begin in the next meeting. The meeting looked ordinary. A glass conference room, laptops open, coffee cups scattered across the table. But the atmosphere shifted the moment I walked in. At the head of the table sat Martin, the operations manager who had led these meetings for years. He was confident, experienced, and used to being the voice everyone followed. The presentation began as usual: slides, forecasts, timelines. Everything sounded polished until the contract details appeared on the screen. Something felt slightly off. Not obviously wrong, just incomplete. When Martin finished, he leaned back and asked, "Any questions?" The room stayed quiet. Then the director looked at me. "Trifina?" I glanced at the timeline again before speaking. "Which contingency clause are we using if the client delays phase 2? Martin frowned slightly. "That's unlikely," he said. "Maybe," I replied calmly. "But the contract allows a 45-day extension." Someone from finance flipped through the agreement. "She's right. Clause 14.3. The room grew quieter. The director leaned forward. "What happens to the schedule if that clause is used?" Martin paused. It was brief but noticeable. Because in leadership rooms, hesitation is louder than noise. I didn't challenge him. I simply waited. Finally, the director turned back to me. "What would you recommend?" "Build the delay into the baseline timeline," I said. "If they don't use it, we gain time. If they do, we don't lose leverage." The director nodded. "Update the plan." No one argued. And in that moment, something subtle happened. Martin was still leading the meeting, but the room had started listening to someone else. For the first time since I joined the company, control had shifted slightly, and everyone felt it. About 20 minutes after the meeting, I received a message. "Trifina, can you come upstairs?" It was from Elaine Carter, our department director. Her office overlooked the city, quiet and minimal, the kind of place where conversations carried weight even when spoken softly. She gestured for me to sit. "I watched the meeting," she said. I nodded. "You handled that well." Then she added something more thoughtful. "You've always been capable, but you used to stay in the background." "I was learning," I replied. She raised an eyebrow. "Learning what?" "How the room works." Elaine leaned back slightly. "That explains the past few months," she said. "Your reports have been very precise." I didn't answer. She already understood. After a moment, she continued. "The executive committee reviews leadership candidates twice a year. I knew about the process, but I had never imagined being part of it. I'd like to include you in the next review cycle." The words landed quietly. No ceremony, no excitement, just an open door. "You don't seem surprised," she said. "I didn't expect it," I answered, "but I prepared for the possibility." Elaine nodded. "Good. That's exactly what leadership requires." When I left her office, the hallway looked exactly the same as it always had, but the balance in the room had already begun to change. A few months later, my role changed. Not dramatically, just enough to place me in rooms where decisions were made. What surprised me, that wasn't the title. It was the shift in behavior. People who once ignored my ideas now ask for my opinion before meetings. Managers who used to interrupt me listened more carefully. Even Martin adjusted. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk and said something simple. "You were right about that timeline." Then he added quietly, "I should have listened earlier." I nodded. Not because I needed the apology, but because acknowledgement was enough. Looking back, I understand something I didn't understand at the beginning. My mistake wasn't being quiet. My mistake was thinking quiet meant invisible. It doesn't. Quite simply means choosing when to speak. Influence doesn't always come from pushing harder than everyone else. Sometimes it comes from preparation, patience, and consistency, from letting your work speak before you do. So if people underestimate you, Don't rush to correct them. Use the time to build something stronger than their assumptions. Because when the moment finally comes, your voice won't need to be loud, it will simply be clear. And I'm curious about you. Have you ever been underestimated at work? And if you were in my position, would you have stayed quiet and prepared, or spoken up earlier?